The longship Sea Raven cut through the dark waters of the North Sea, its dragon-carved prow splitting the waves as 30 Viking warriors pulled at their oars in steady rhythm. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the deck where Bjorn Ironside stood with his legs spread wide, surveying his crew with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. At 28 winters old, Bjorn had earned his place as war leader through countless raids along the Saxon coast. His broad shoulders bore the scars of many battles, and his thick blonde beard was braided with silver rings taken from fallen enemies. The iron sword at his side had tasted blood in 3 kingdoms, and his reputation preceded him into every hall and settlement from the fjords of Norway to the shores of Ireland. "Look at you miserable dogs," Bjorn called out, his voice carrying easily over the sound of waves and creaking wood. "Rowing like old women heading to market. At this pace, we'll reach the Saxon monastery when the monks have already died of old age." The crew continued their steady rhythm, but several men exchanged glances. They had been rowing since dawn, following the coast southward toward the rich lands of Northumbria, where fat monasteries waited like ripe fruit ready for picking. Their backs ached, and their hands were raw from gripping the ashwood oars, but they endured because that was the way of the sea wolves. Bjorn walked among them, his leather boots silent on the wet deck. He stopped beside Olaf the Grey, whose weathered face showed 40 winters of hard living. "You pull like a fish gasping on dry land, old man. Perhaps you should stay on shore next time and tend the sheep with the women." Olaf's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had sailed with Bjorn's father before the war leader was even born, and his experience had saved their lives more times than could be counted. Yet Bjorn seemed to delight in finding fault with every man aboard. "And you, Ragnar," Bjorn continued, pointing at a young warrior whose red hair gleamed in the afternoon light. "Your stroke is as weak as your chin beard. Did your mother send a boy to do a man's work?" The insults continued as Bjorn made his way through the crew. He criticized Thorvald's grip on his oar, mocked Eric's worn leather boots, and questioned whether Gunnar had the strength to lift a sword when the time came for battle. Each comment was delivered with a laugh, as if the whole thing were merely good-natured jesting. But the edge in his voice cut deeper than any blade. Near the stern of the ship, a slight figure hunched over his oar with determined concentration. Knut Eriksson was barely 18 winters old, small for a Viking, but quick and clever. His father had been a respected warrior who died fighting the Danes 2 summers past, leaving Knut to make his own way in the world. Unable to afford proper war gear, he served as shield-bearer to Bjorn, carrying the war leader's extra weapons and tending to his equipment in exchange for a share of the plunder. Bjorn's gaze fell on Knut, and his expression shifted to one of particular disdain. "Ah, here's our brave shield-bearer," he announced loudly. "Tell me, little Knut, when the Saxons come charging with their axes, will you hide behind my shield or simply run away screaming like a child?" The other warriors stopped rowing to listen. Some looked uncomfortable, while others grinned in anticipation of more entertainment. Knut's face flushed red, but he kept his eyes fixed on his oar. "Perhaps we should leave you at the monastery to become a monk," Bjorn continued, his voice dripping with false concern. "You could pray for our souls while real warriors claim the gold. I'm sure the Christ followers would welcome such a meek little lamb into their flock." Laughter rippled through some of the crew, though it sounded forced. Knut's hands tightened on his oar handle until his knuckles went white. His breathing came faster, and the muscles in his thin arms trembled with more than just exhaustion from rowing. "What's wrong, shield-bearer?" Bjorn pressed, stepping closer. "Cat got your tongue, or are you too busy dreaming about your mother's cooking to pay attention to your betters?" The words hit their mark. Knut's mother had died birthing his younger sister, who lived only 3 days. The wounds from that loss still ran deep, and Bjorn's casual cruelty opened them fresh. Something dark flickered in Knut's pale blue eyes. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting the longship in golden light, the tension aboard the Sea Raven grew thick as fog. The steady rhythm of oars continued, but beneath the surface, something dangerous was building. Bjorn Ironside, drunk on his own power and reputation, had pushed his crew hard throughout the long day, but he had yet to learn that even the smallest wolf, when cornered and wounded, could bare its teeth. The Saxon coast grew larger on the horizon, promising rich plunder for those bold enough to take it. Yet the greatest danger to the crew of the Sea Raven might not come from enemy warriors, but from the poison of pride and the breaking point of a young man's patience. The monastery of St. Cuthbert stood like a beacon against the darkening sky as the sea raven approached the Northumbrian shore. Its stone walls rose from a rocky promontory, and the sound of evening prayers drifted across the water in the ancient tongue of the Christ followers. Smoke curled from the settlement's chimneys, and torchlight flickered in the windows, painting a picture of peaceful prosperity that made every Viking aboard lick his lips in anticipation. Bjorn stood at the prow, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. The wind whipped his braided hair as he studied their target with the calculating eye of a predator. "Look there, my wolves," he called back to his crew. "The monks have grown fat on their offerings to their wooden god. Tonight we'll teach them that silver serves Odin's sons better than Christ's." Lambs. The crew had beached their longship in a hidden cove 2 miles south of the monastery as the last light faded from the western sky. Now they prepared their weapons by torchlight, checking sword edges and adjusting mail shirts. The familiar ritual of preparation before a raid usually brought the men together in brotherhood, but tonight, an uncomfortable tension hung over the group like a storm cloud. Knut moved quietly among the warriors, helping them with their gear as was his duty. He adjusted the leather straps on Thorvald's helmet, handed Eric his favourite axe, and checked the bindings on several shields. His movements were efficient and practiced, but his face remained pale and drawn from the humiliation he had endured during the day's journey. "Shield bearer," Bjorn's voice cut through the murmur of preparation. "Fetch my mail shirt and see that it's properly oiled. And mind you, don't drop it in the sand like you did my helmet last winter." Knut had never dropped Bjorn's helmet, but he said nothing. He retrieved the heavy mail from the sea chest and began examining each iron ring for signs of rust or damage. The shirt was magnificent, crafted by the best smiths in Norway, and worth more silver than most farmers saw in a lifetime. "Careful with that, boy," Bjorn continued, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That mail has saved my life in more battles than you've seen summers. Though I suppose it would fit you like a dress, wouldn't it? Perhaps we should find you a nice blue gown to match your eyes." More forced laughter from some of the crew, but several men looked away uncomfortably. Olaf the Grey shook his grizzled head and muttered something under his breath that sounded like disapproval. As Knut held up the mail shirt, Bjorn snatched it away roughly. "By Thor's hammer, you handle it like you're afraid it might bite you. How do you expect to serve a real warrior when you flinch at the sight of proper war gear?" The young man's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. He had learned long ago that arguing with Bjorn only brought more punishment and mockery. Better to endure and wait for the storm to pass. But Bjorn was not finished. As he pulled the mail over his head, he continued his assault on Knut's dignity. "Tell me, shield-bearer, when we charge into battle, will you remember which end of a spear to hold? Or shall I tie a string to it so you don't forget?" "I know how to fight," Knut said quietly, the first words he had spoken since morning. Bjorn's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "It speaks, and with such bold words too. Very well then, little wolf. Perhaps you'd like to prove yourself tonight. When we storm the monastery walls, you can charge ahead of the rest of us. Show these seasoned warriors how it's done." The suggestion drew uncomfortable glances from the crew. Sending the shield-bearer ahead was as good as killing him, and everyone knew it. Even among Vikings who prized courage above all else, there were unwritten rules about protecting the young and inexperienced. "That's enough. Bjorn," Olaf the Grey spoke up, his weathered face stern in the torchlight. "The boy serves his purpose well enough. Save your anger for the Saxons." Bjorn whirled on the older man, his eyes flashing dangerously. "Did I ask for your counsel, old man? Perhaps you're getting soft in your dotage. Maybe you and the shield-bearer can stay behind and guard the ship while the real warriors claim the glory." The insult to Olaf brought murmurs of displeasure from several crew members. The grey-bearded warrior had proven his worth in countless battles and had earned the right to speak his mind, but Bjorn seemed determined to pick fights with his own men rather than focus on the coming raid. Knut watched the exchange with growing anger. It was one thing to mock him. He was young and had not yet proven himself in battle. But to insult Olaf, who had served Bjorn's father with honour and distinction, was beyond acceptable. The old warrior had been kind to Knut, teaching him sword work and sharing stories of glorious raids in distant lands. As the crew finished their preparations and began moving inland toward the monastery, Bjorn continued his verbal assault on anyone who caught his attention. He questioned Ragnar's courage, mocked Eric's new sword, and suggested that half his crew would flee at the first sign of resistance. With each word, Each cutting remark, the bonds that held the crew together, grew weaker. Vikings followed strong leaders, but strength was not just about sword skill and battle fury. A true war leader inspired loyalty and protected his men, even the weakest among them. Knut trudged along at the rear of the group, carrying Bjorn's spare weapons and watching his leader tear apart the unity that should have bound them together. In the darkness ahead lay the monastery with its treasures and sleeping monks. But behind them, in the heart of their own band, something far more dangerous was taking shape. The shield-bearer's hand rested on the small eating knife at his belt, the only weapon he was allowed to carry. His knuckles were white with tension, and his breathing came in short, sharp bursts that had nothing to do with the climb up from the beach. The monastery walls loomed before them in the moonlight, built of dark stone that had weathered countless northern storms. Brother Marcus walked the ramparts as he did every night, his sandaled feet silent on the worn stones as he offered prayers for the safety of his fellow monks sleeping in their cells below. The gentleman had no idea that 30 Viking warriors crouched in the tall grass, barely 50 paces from where he stood. Bjorn studied the walls with practiced eyes, noting the height of the battlements and the spacing of the guard towers. This would be an easy victory. The monks had grown complacent in their isolation, trusting to their god's protection rather than building proper defenses. A few of the younger brothers might try to resist, but most would flee or beg for mercy when the Northmen came howling over their walls. "Listen well," Bjorn whispered to his gathered crew. "We go over the wall in 3 groups. Thorvald, take 5 men to the eastern tower. Ragnar, 5 more to the western gate. The rest follow me over the main wall to secure the chapel where they keep their silver." The warriors nodded their understanding, checking their weapons one final time. This was familiar work. They had raided dozens of monasteries along the Saxon coast, and each followed the same pattern. Swift violence, gather the treasure, and depart before local lords could organize a response. But as the men began to move into position, Bjorn's attention turned once again to his favorite target. "Shield bearer," he hissed, grabbing Knut by the shoulder. "You'll stay here with the spare weapons. Try not to lose them while the real warriors do the work." Knut's face flushed with shame and anger. "I can fight. Let me prove myself." "Prove yourself?" Bjorn's laugh was harsh and mocking. "You can barely lift my shield without stumbling. What use would you be in battle? No, little lamb. You'll wait here like a good servant and pray to whatever gods protect cowards." The words struck like physical blows. Around them, the other warriors shifted uncomfortably, but none dared speak against their leader's decision. They had their own concerns now. The raid was beginning, and success depended on swift, coordinated action. As the group split up to take their positions, Olaf the Grey paused beside Knut. "Stay calm, lad," he whispered. "Your time will come." Then he followed Bjorn toward the main wall, leaving the young shield-bearer alone in the darkness with his shame and rage. Knut crouched behind a low stone wall that had once marked the boundary of a farmer's field, now overgrown with brambles and weeds. In his hands he held Bjorn's spare sword and seax, weapons that represented everything he longed to be, but was denied. The weight of the sword felt good in his grip, not too heavy, perfectly balanced by the skilled smith who had forged it. From the monastery came the sounds of violence beginning. A shout of alarm from Brother Marcus on the wall, quickly cut short. The crash of the eastern gate being forced open. The first screams of terrified monks roused from sleep to find armed pagans in their sacred halls. Bjorn's voice rose above the chaos, issuing commands and threats in the Norse tongue. Even from a distance, Knut could hear the arrogance and cruelty in those familiar tones. The war leader was in his element now, reveling in the fear of his victims and the admiration of his followers. But something went wrong with the raid's timing. A group of Saxon warriors, perhaps guards from a nearby lord's hall, came thundering up the coastal road on horseback. Their mail gleamed in the moonlight, and their war cries echoed off the monastery walls as they charged toward the breach in the defences. Knut watched from his hiding place as the Saxons dismounted and formed a shield wall at the monastery's main entrance. They were outnumbered, but they had the advantage of position and the desperate courage of men defending their sacred ground. Steel rang against steel as Viking and Saxon warriors clashed in the narrow gateway. In the confusion of battle, Knut saw his chance, not to prove himself to Bjorn. He was beyond caring about that now. but to show the crew that he was more than just a servant and target for mockery. He gripped the spare sword tighter and began moving toward the fight. The battle was fierce, but brief. The Vikings' superior numbers and battle experience told in the end, and the Saxon defenders fell one by one until only their leader remained, wounded and defiant, his back against the monastery's chapel door. As Knut approached the scene, he heard Bjorn's triumphant laughter echoing from the courtyard. "Look at this Saxon dog, still snarling even with my blade at his throat. Tell me, Christ follower, where do you keep your silver? Speak quickly, and I might let you die with honor." But instead of heading toward the monastery to join the celebration of victory, Knut found himself moving toward where the crew had gathered to divide the spoils. His anger had been building all day like pressure in a sealed pot, and now it threatened to explode with devastating force. Bjorn emerged from the chapel carrying a heavy silver cross, his face flushed with triumph and greed. When he saw Knut approaching with drawn sword, his expression shifted to one of amused contempt. "What's this? The shield-bearer wants to play warrior now? Did you come to protect me from the terrible Saxon farmers?" The mocking laughter that followed was the final straw. Years of humiliation, months of constant belittlement, and this night's ultimate shame crashed together in Knut's mind like a breaking wave. The young man's vision narrowed until he could see nothing but Bjorn's sneering face, hear nothing but that cruel, dismissive laughter. "I said you were worthless," Bjorn continued, setting down the silver cross and drawing his own blade. "But perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps you're worse than worthless. Perhaps you're dangerous to have around. A coward with a sword is more threat to his friends than his enemies." The words sealed both their fates. With a wordless cry of rage that had been building since dawn, Knut lunged forward with all the speed and desperation of a cornered animal. The blade in his hand caught the moonlight as it arced toward the man who had made his life a living hell. Steel met steel in a shower of sparks as Bjorn barely managed to parry Knut's desperate attack. The war leader's eyes widened in genuine surprise, not at the young man's audacity, for he had pushed him to this point deliberately, but at the skill behind the blow. Someone had been teaching the shield-bearer proper sword work, and he had learned well. "So the pup has teeth after all," Bjorn snarled, recovering his balance and circling to his left. "Good, I was growing tired of your whimpering. At least now you'll die like a man instead of a dog." The other Vikings formed a loose circle around the combatants, their faces grim in the flickering torchlight. This was not how raids were supposed to end, with Viking steel turned against Viking steel, with the unity of the crew shattered by blood and betrayal. Some muttered prayers to Odin and Thor, asking the gods to guide this madness to a swift conclusion. Olaf the Grey pushed forward through the crowd, his weathered face twisted with anguish. "Stop this foolishness. We are brothers in battle, not enemies. Bjorn, call off this madness. The boy has learned his lesson." But Bjorn's blood was up now, his warrior's pride stung by having to defend himself against someone he had dismissed as worthless. "Stand back, old man." This whelp drew steel on his war leader. "There can be only one answer to such betrayal." Knut said nothing, his pale blue eyes fixed on Bjorn's chest where the mail shirt gleamed. His breathing came in short, controlled bursts as he shifted his grip on the sword handle, all the lessons Olaf had taught him during quiet. Moments aboard the ship came flooding back. How to watch an opponent's feet for signs of movement, how to use speed and surprise against a stronger foe, how to turn desperation into deadly purpose. The second exchange was faster and more vicious than the first. Bjorn attacked with the confidence of a veteran warrior, his blade seeking Knut's heart in a straight thrust that should have ended the fight immediately. But the younger man was no longer thinking. He was moving on pure instinct and months of suppressed rage. Knut twisted aside from the thrust and brought his sword around in a sweeping cut that caught Bjorn across the ribs. The mail shirt held, but the impact sent the war leader staggering sideways into the stone wall of the chapel. For a moment, genuine fear flickered in Bjorn's eyes as he realized this was no longer a game of dominance and humiliation. "You little bastard," Bjorn gasped, tasting blood where he had bitten his tongue. "I should have drowned you years ago like the runt of the litter you are." The words might have broken Knut's spirit hours earlier, but now they only fed the fire burning in his chest. He pressed his attack with renewed fury, raining blow after blow on Bjorn's defenses. The war leader was stronger and more experienced, but he was also tired from the night's raid and caught off guard by his opponent's sudden transformation. from cowering servant to deadly enemy. Around them, the crew watched in horrified fascination as their world turned upside down. These were men who lived by the sword, who understood that violence was the final arbiter of all disputes. But this felt different. This was not the clean brutality of battle against enemies, but something poisonous and shameful that would stain them all. Thorvald stepped forward, his hand on his axe handle. "Enough of this madness. I'll end it myself if you won't see reason." But Ragnar caught his arm, shaking his head grimly. "No, this has gone too far for outside interference. Let the gods decide who lives and who dies." The fight continued with increasing desperation on both sides. Bjorn's superior skill began to tell as his initial shock wore off, and he started to press Knut back toward the monastery's courtyard fountain. The young man's attacks became wilder and less controlled as exhaustion began to set in, and several times only luck saved him from Bjorn's counterstrikes. "Getting tired already?" Bjorn taunted between his own gasping breaths. "This is why boys shouldn't play with men's weapons. You lack the strength for real fighting." But even as he spoke, Bjorn was beginning to realize that his mockery had created something far more dangerous than he had intended. The frightened, submissive shield-bearer was gone, replaced by something primal and murderous that cared nothing for consequences or survival, only for ending the torment that had defined his existence. Knut's next attack came from an unexpected angle, a low thrust aimed at Bjorn's thigh, where the mail shirt left a gap. The war leader managed to deflect it, but not entirely. The sword point scored a deep cut along his leg that sent hot blood streaming down to pool in his leather boot. The wound was not mortal, but it changed the dynamic of the fight. Bjorn's movements became more cautious, his left leg unable to bear his full weight. For the first time since the combat began, the initiative passed to Knut. The young man pressed forward with grim determination, no longer the desperate animal who had launched the initial attack. Pain and exhaustion had burned away everything except his will to end this, to silence forever the voice that had poisoned his days and haunted his dreams. "You want to know what I think of you, Bjorn Ironside?" Knut spoke for the first time since drawing his blade, his voice steady despite his labored breathing. "I think you're a bully and a coward who mistakes cruelty for strength. I think your father would be ashamed to see what his son became." The words hit their target better than any sword thrust could have. Bjorn's face contorted with rage, and he lunged forward in a wild attack that left him overextended and off balance. It was exactly the opening Knut had been waiting for. The end came with shocking suddenness. Knut stepped inside Bjorn's guard and drove his blade upward beneath the mail shirt, finding the gap where leather and iron failed to protect. Steel pierced flesh and muscle, sliding between ribs to find the heart that had never learned compassion or mercy. Bjorn Ironside looked down at the sword protruding from his chest with an expression of profound surprise, as if he could not quite believe that his torment of others had finally come back to claim him. He opened his mouth to speak, but only blood came out, dark and thick in the torchlight. As the war leader collapsed to his knees and then fell forward onto the cold stones, the monastery courtyard fell silent, except for the crackling of flames and the distant sound of waves against the shore. The Vikings stared at the body of their leader and the blood-spattered young man who had killed him, uncertain what came next, in a world where nothing would ever be the same. The silence stretched long and heavy across the monastery courtyard as 29 Vikings stared at the body of their fallen leader. Bjorn Ironside lay motionless on the ancient stones, his life's blood pooling beneath him like a dark mirror reflecting the torchlight. The silver cross he had stolen gleamed mockingly beside his outstretched hand, its Christian symbols seeming to judge the violence that had unfolded in this sacred place. Knut stood over the corpse, the bloodied sword still gripped in his trembling hands. The rage that had sustained him through the fight was ebbing away, leaving behind a hollow emptiness and the terrible weight of what he had done. He had killed his war leader, shattered the sacred bonds that held their crew together, and violated every code that governed Viking society. Olaf the Grey was the first to move, stepping forward with the careful dignity of a man who had seen too much death to be shocked by one more corpse. He placed a gentle hand on Knut's shoulder, feeling the young man's muscles twitching with exhaustion and the aftermath of battle fury. "Lower the sword, lad," Olaf said quietly. "It's finished now. Knut's fingers seemed frozen around the weapon's grip, but gradually he managed to open them. The blade fell to the stones with a metallic ring that echoed off the monastery walls. Without its weight in his hands, he swayed on his feet like a tree about to fall. What happens now? The question came from Ragnar, whose young voice cracked with uncertainty. At barely 20 winters, he had never seen authority challenged so directly, had never witnessed the violent overthrow of everything he thought permanent and unchanging. The crew looked to Olaf for guidance, their faces reflecting the same confusion and fear. Vikings lived by clearly defined hierarchies. Jarls commanded huskarls, war leaders commanded their crews, fathers commanded their sons. When those structures collapsed, chaos followed as surely as winter followed summer. "Now we decide what kind of men we are," Olaf replied, his weathered face grave in the flickering light. "Bjorn is dead by his own making. He pushed this boy beyond all endurance, treated him worse than a thrall, and forgot that even the meekest wolf has fangs when cornered." Thorvald shifted his weight from foot to foot, his hand resting unconsciously on his axe handle. "The boy killed his war leader. That's death by any law, Norse or Saxon. Blood demands blood. Does it?" Olaf's voice carried the authority of his years and experience. What law did Bjorn follow when he tormented this lad day after day? What honor was there in his mockery and cruelty? A good leader protects his men, even the weakest among them. Bjorn forgot that lesson, and it cost him his life. The debate that followed was conducted in low, urgent voices as the Vikings struggled to find their way through unfamiliar territory. Some argued for immediate vengeance against Knut, insisting that discipline and order must be maintained at all costs. Others pointed out that Bjorn's behavior had become increasingly erratic and cruel, that his leadership had been poisoning the crew's unity for months. During the discussion, Knut stood silent and still, staring down at the man he had killed. There was no satisfaction in victory, no sense of justice served, only the cold knowledge that he had crossed a line from which there could be no return. Whether his crewmates killed him or spared him, he would never again be the frightened boy who had cowered under Bjorn's abuse. "I accept judgment," Knut said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I drew steel on my war leader and took his life. If death is the price, I'll pay it." The simple dignity of his words seemed to settle something in the crew's minds. This was not the defiant challenge of a rebel seeking power, but the acceptance of consequences by someone who had reached the breaking point and acted without thought for himself. Eric the Bold, whose scarred face bore testimony to many battles, stepped forward. The boy spoke true about Bjorn. "These past months our leader became something twisted and cruel. I've served under many war leaders, good and bad, but none who took such pleasure in grinding their own men into the dirt." One by one, other voices joined in agreement. Stories emerged of Bjorn's increasing cruelty, his petty tyrannies and deliberate humiliations. The picture that formed was of a man who had let success and unchallenged authority corrupt him, until he became the very thing a Viking leader should never be. A bully who ruled through fear rather than earning loyalty through deed and honor. As dawn began to break over the North Sea, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the crew reached their decision. Knut would live, but he could no longer sail with them. The bonds of crew brotherhood had been too deeply damaged by what had transpired. He would take his share of the night's plunder and make his own way in the world. "Where will you go?" Olaf asked as they prepared to return to their longship. The monastery lay empty now, its treasures divided among the survivors, according to their ancient customs. Knut looked toward the rising sun, then back at the crew who had been his family for 3 years. "East, perhaps. I've heard there are opportunities for men with strong sword arms in the service of the Byzantine emperor. Or maybe I'll find passage to Iceland, start fresh where no one knows my name." The old warrior nodded approvingly. "That's wisdom, lad. Learn from this night, but don't let it poison your future. You have skill with a blade and courage when pressed to it. Those are valuable things in any land." As the Sea Raven sailed away from the Northumbrian coast, with one less crew member and a new leader chosen by common consent, Knut stood alone on the beach, watching it disappear into the morning haze. The silver coins in his pouch would buy passage to wherever he chose to go, and the sword at his side would serve him in whatever battles lay ahead. He had killed the man who tormented him, but found no peace in it. He had proven his courage, but at the cost of everything familiar and certain in his life. As he turned away from the sea and began walking inland toward an uncertain future, Knut carried with him hard-won knowledge about the price of both cruelty and justice. Behind him, the waves erased all trace of the Sea Raven's passage, while ahead lay roads that led to distant lands where a young warrior might forge a new destiny, free from the shadows of his past. The shield-bearer was dead, but from his ashes had risen someone stronger, someone who would never again bow his head to any bully. No matter how powerful they seemed, in the end, Bjorn Ironside's greatest failure was not in dying by a lesser man's blade, but in creating the very enemy who destroyed him. The boy he had tormented into becoming a killer now walked free under the morning sun, carrying hard-earned wisdom about the true nature of strength and the terrible consequences when pride and cruelty replace honor and justice. The end.